had to create a list of the 5 people who are your best friends, who would be on that list? And even more so, what would be the criteria you would use to determine who is or who is not on that list? The 5 people that you would put on that list are likely people that would constitute an interpersonal relationship. Hi, I'm Greg Rickard, a faculty member at Bluegrass Community and Technical College, and welcome to today's Key Concepts presentation on understanding the interpersonal relationship, or describing the interpersonal relationship. As we study interpersonal communication, what you will see is that largely the concepts that we discuss related to interpersonal communication are really talking about relationships between people. First of all, we'll start by describing qualitative and quantitative relationships. We then will take a look at the perspectives of interpersonal versus impersonal relationships or encounters. And finally, we'll look at computer-mediated communication and how interpersonal relationships may apply to computer-mediated communication. Let's start by looking at 2 different ways to describe relationships: a quantitative perspective and a qualitative perspective. Using the quantitative perspective of relationships, quantity means number. So in a quantitative description of a relationship, we would base the relationship on the number of opportunities we have for interacting with other people. Or, more simply stated, the people we interact with more frequently, we are more likely to have a relationship with. Now, while this may sound like common sense, what we want to look at is what might be some instances where we do interact with people on a regular basis, but don't necessarily have a close relationship. For example, perhaps at school there is an individual or a couple of individuals that you pass in the hallway on a regular basis. This creates opportunity for interaction, and maybe you do interact by making eye contact or maybe by exchanging a greeting, hello, how are you? But would we really say that this is a close relationship? Quantitatively, we could say that the relationship is close. However, in reality, if all we exchange are informal greetings with this individual, do we really have a close relationship? The other perspective that we can use in describing a relationship is a qualitative perspective, or a qualitative definition of the relationship. This type of description focuses on the quality of the interaction, what is exchanged, rather than the quantity or the number of times that we interact with an individual. In describing a relationship based on a qualitative perspective, there are a variety of things that we look at in order to define that relationship. First of all, we look at the uniqueness of the relationship, meaning that the 2 individuals or maybe 3 individuals that share a relationship treat one another as unique individuals with unique characteristics, unique personalities, and understanding that that individual is different from any other individual. A second characteristic in a qualitative perspective is irreplaceability, meaning that we understand that there is no one who can replace this particular relationship, that each relationship has individual circumstances or characteristics, and we can't just put anyone else in place of any other person if we have a qualitative relationship with that person. Third, we would look at interdependence, meaning that you rely on this other person for certain things, this other person relies on you for certain things, but there is an exchange and interdependence between yourself and the other person. The fourth characteristic of a qualitative relationship is disclosure. And we will discuss disclosure at length as we look at interpersonal communication. But for now, disclosure simply means the sharing of personal information between yourself and the other person. So if there is a certain amount of personal information that's exchanged between you and the other person, you're more likely to have a qualitative relationship rather than a quantitative relationship. And then finally, we can take a look at rewards. The rewards of the relationship in determining is this a quantitative or qualitative relationship. In a quantitative relationship, usually the reward is that there is some outcome that you're seeking as a result of that interaction. For example, when you go to the bank, you may interact with a particular teller on a regular basis, but the reward of that interaction is conducting whatever business it is that you have with that bank, whether it's making a deposit or withdrawing money from your account. In a qualitative relationship, the reward is not some particular outcome or achieving some task, but the reward is intrinsic, meaning that the reward of the interaction is maintaining that relationship. The relationship itself is the reward in a qualitative interaction. A second way that we can look at relationships is by looking at an interpersonal relationship versus an impersonal relationship, or having an interpersonal interaction versus an impersonal interaction. In an impersonal interaction, much like the example with the bank teller, the person on the other end of that interaction is exchangeable. For instance, if I want to go to the bank and make a deposit, there may be 4 tellers at the counter that I could interact with. And it wouldn't matter if I had teller number 1, number 2, number 3, or number 4. The outcome of the interaction is going to be the same, meaning that the interaction is largely impersonal. I'm seeking a particular outcome. Whereas in an interpersonal interaction, you're seeking to further that particular relationship. That there's something more than just achieving a task, but it's maintaining and furthering that relationship. As our graphic depicts, we can't really say that all relationships are either interpersonal or impersonal. But really our relationships exist on a continuum, some being more towards the interpersonal end of that continuum, and some being more towards the impersonal end of that continuum. In the same way, we can take individual encounters and classify them as either interpersonal or impersonal. Meaning that even in interpersonal relationships, there may be impersonal interactions that we have. For example, if I have a friend that works at an athletic ticket office and I need to find out how much tickets are for a particular ball game. Well, of course, I could go to other sources like the internet and find out how much tickets are, or I could simply call this individual and ask them to give me that information. While I may have an interpersonal relationship with that individual, we may have a friendship outside, the interaction itself is impersonal, meaning I'm simply looking to obtain a certain amount of information from someone who I have an interpersonal relationship with. Let's now take a look at a different setting of a relationship, and that being a computer-mediated relationship, or a relationship that's maintained through computer-mediated communication. Computer-mediated communication includes email, instant messaging. We also could include chat rooms as a form of computer-mediated communication, and to a certain extent even text messaging via a cell phone. These relationships are different from our face-to-face relationships. Well, how are they different? Well, first of all, as you probably understand, in a computer-mediated relationship, you are interacting based on text or language forms of communication. A lot of nonverbal elements of communication, like facial expressions, like gestures, are absent from a computer-mediated interaction. So we have a text or language-based form of interaction. So our question is, can we really form an interpersonal relationship based on a text or language-only form of interaction? And this is a question that we really don't know the answer to at this time. Clearly, there are some people who form and maintain relationships via computer-mediated communication, through online chats, through exchanging emails, through exchanging instant messages. But the question is, are we able to compensate for some of these nonverbal forms of communication in a language or text-only based form of communication? Researcher Joe Walther has looked extensively into this, and specifically looking at nonverbal elements of language or text-based messages. And what he has discovered is that not only can interpersonal relationships be formed through computer-mediated communication, but he also uses a term called hyperpersonal relationships that can be formed through computer-mediated communication, meaning that in this type of interaction, often people will engage in more in-depth exchange of information or more in-depth disclosure through computer-mediated communication than they would in face-to-face forms of communication. So let's review what we've covered in this introduction to interpersonal communication. First of all, we've talked about describing relationships or interactions based on a quantitative perspective versus a qualitative perspective. We've also discussed the idea that we have both interpersonal and impersonal relationships. Within those relationships, both interpersonal and impersonal interactions. And finally, we've taken a look at a unique form of interaction through computer-mediated communication and discussed some of the factors that influence relationships that are computer-mediated versus face-to-face communication. Hopefully the discussion of these topics has helped you to broaden your perspective of what we talk about and what we mean when we use the term interpersonal communication. And hopefully has given you the perspective that when we talk about interpersonal communication, really what we're talking about is relationships between people.